Hi, and welcome to the 2-minute warning. This is our 4-night series that will be beginning tonight and running through Friday, August 11th. And so before we begin, I want to introduce the publisher of the Westside Gazette, where we write each week about voting and the issues that are within our community. And I want to introduce my co-host for today, Mr. Bobby Henry.
Good evening, and welcome to the 2-minute warning. Any opportunity that I have to represent the 193 years of the Black press and the 80 years of the NNPA and the 50 years of the Westside Gazette, it's a privilege, and it holds me accountable to what we present to our communities. So it's an honor for me to be a part of this program with our very capable host, Mr. Perry Busby, and to you, the listening audience. We hope that we're able to get across some much needed information and that it really causes us to be more involved with the entire process of voting. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. We're going to let this be a more informal. I don't want this to come across as some stage presentation because the information is really critical, and I don't want it to come across as so stage for you because it's really going to be exciting. And before we begin with our guests, I do want to set forth some ground rules. Our guests will be coming on shortly. If you have questions during her presentation, we ask that you preface your comments with a QQ, that's QQ, before a question that you want to pose to our guest for tonight. But we do encourage you, as she is talking, if you do have dialogue amongst yourselves, to really engage in dialogue, because that's what this is about. We are about educating and setting forth some strategies, because come November 3rd, we're in for what could be a rude awakening. We've been distracted by a lot of the antics that are going on. We've been distracted by COVID, rightly so. But come November 3rd, the ballot box becomes ground zero for where we determine the next steps of this country. And so it is incumbent upon us to understand this process. For so long, we've been talking about voting and let's vote. But there is another side of voting that happens once the polls close. We know about suppression and the fight to get to the poll. Well, we have to understand that there is another fight, another kind of suppression that happens once our votes get cast. And so in doing this research, I came across some very capable people who began to enlighten me, and they were writing articles in several of the papers around the country. Many of us may have never seen those articles because they never got a lot of attention, but they are there. They are on the internet. And so what I wanted to do was begin to bring some of these voices to our community, because in the minority community is where many of these undercounts and the problems that we see with our elections really centers around the African American community, as well as the the Hispanic, and as we will find out soon, also the Korean community. We're going to begin. I want to begin by introducing our guest for tonight. Jennifer Cohn was one of the first journalists that I began to follow when I started looking into this issue of election integrity. And Jennifer is known for writing some really cutting edge articles that talks about the insecurity and the vulnerability of our computerized election systems. Many of her articles have appeared in the New York Review of Books. She's often seen writing for WhoWhatWhy, which is an online publication, TYT Investigates, the Brad blog, and Salon. Jennifer wrote a very insightful article back in May that I really recommend that you read. It's called Touchscreen Voting Machines and the Vanishing Black Votes. That came out in May and really caused a stir. And so I was really hoping that I could get her on. And she was one of the first people that we reached out to when we talked about the 2-minute warning. So I just want to introduce a very good colleague and friend, Jennifer Cohn. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. Hi, thank you guys, both of you very much for inviting me to be on your show. This is great.
Yes, great. We're going to get right into
quite
it.
Centered? Okay. Oops.
Are you a listener? Okay. Yeah. No, we're not professionals. We're just dedicated to our work.
Do our best.
We're going to yes. We're going to start with, how did you get involved in election integrity? Because when I started looking at some of my research back in 2017, I just heard about this Jennifer Cohn lady on Twitter. And back then, it was a small group, but oh gosh, you got a great following. So how did you get started?
So I was really upset by the outcome of the 2016 election, and that is what got me interested. Somebody asked for help researching voting machines, and I was not inherently interested, but I practiced law for a long time, so I knew I had the research skills, and what I found got me really upset, the disparity between what we were told as members of the public and what really esteemed election security experts were saying. And the election security experts aren't advocates, they're experts. So there wasn't really enough magnification of what they were saying to the public. And I saw that there was just sort of this gaping hole, that more people needed to understand what we had been told. Certain things like, voting machines supposedly, or it's really hard to hack electronic vote tallies because voting machines never connect to the internet. And that just wasn't true on several fronts. Some of them do connect to the internet, and even if they don't, they can still be hacked. So there were a lot of things, but that's what really caught my interest initially.
Yeah. So I know that sounds scary to people, that our votes really travel over the internet. And most people never knew that it even touched the internet.
Yeah, well, we were expressly told over and over again that they didn't. And yeah, in states like Florida and Texas and Wisconsin and now more recently Michigan, they do send them over the internet, at least the unofficial totals. And so it's not so much, well, I'm going to talk about it, but the concern is that if you send it over the internet, it creates an opening for, you suddenly are bringing in foreign nation states, that possibility anyway, where they can get in through the internet to both the precinct equipment and to the county equipment that they receive all of the precinct totals, and they have to compile them together. So there's a county computer called a central tabulator, and this creates an opening for both of those. So at the precinct and at the county central tabulator. And then, yeah, they could change the official totals once they're in there. So that's a concern.
Yeah. Well, we're going to let you get started with your presentation because I don't want to dive in because I know for a lot of people, once they start hearing some technical terms, they may get a little afraid. But I do want to encourage everyone that this is very layman. And so Jennifer, I know, will take us through it so that we can understand it. And like I say, if there's any questions that you have during her presentation, go ahead and write them in the chat and we will record them so that we can ask them at the end. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer Cohn.
Okay, well, we'll hope the screen sharing works. Hang on. That look okay? Yeah. Okay. So this it looks fine, huh?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to start out with the concept of transparency, and this is something that we don't usually talk about transparency in connection with elections in the United States, but in other countries they do. Many Western democracies they do. And the concept really means that the public is able to observe and easily understand all of the processes used to count their votes. And so this is something that we should be talking about with our elections, but we don't, and I really encourage people to use that term. In the United States, rather than have transparent elections, which would typically mean hand-marked paper ballots counted in public, the public can actually watch it on election night. That would be very transparent. Instead, we in the United States, we use machines, and we have very long ballots in the United States. A lot of different races are on our ballots, a lot of different referendums. And so whereas some Western democracies, really many, and Canada for its federal elections, they do the transparent elections where they hand count in public on election night. In the US, we use machines to count our votes. And not only that, we use machines to record our votes, like mark our votes on paper for us, which is really unnecessary. And because we use machines and because we can't see inside the machines, this really leaves us at the mercy of election officials to tell us to tell us if something has gone wrong. And what we're learning, especially recently, is that we aren't always told when things go wrong. And so, for example, in the 2016 election, whereas the public was told by the media and officials that Russia was really focusing, it had targeted a lot of state election systems, maybe all of them, but had focused mostly on voter registration systems. As it turns out, according to 4 senior members of the Obama administration, as of August 2016, Russian actors actually were in a position to change electronic vote tallies in at least some places in the United States. So this is, we weren't told this for a while. That's due to a lack of transparency. Generally speaking, if you want to prevent fraud, you want as much transparency as possible. And this translates to as little equipment as possible because, again, these electronic voting machines are black boxes. We can't see what's happening inside of them. But there are a number of obstacles to transparency, and one of the main ones has to do with the companies that sell voting equipment, and they are profit motivated more so than security motivated. And therefore, they want to sell more machines, not less, and that again makes our elections less transparent. So one of the things that really struck me after the 2016 election is that we were told by so many people that our elections are too decentralized to allow an outcome-altering attack. But the reality is that just 2 vendors, ES&S and Dominion Voting, account for more than 80% of US election equipment. And what this means is that if a bad actor were to infiltrate either company or both, and this could either be a bad act, a corrupt insider, an employee, or it could be a hacker. But if they were to infiltrate either company, they could really wreak havoc on elections, really in many places in the United States. So Dominion voting, one of those two I just mentioned, really is a newcomer to the US election scene. It arrived in about 2010 is when it joined the US voting machine market. Before 2010, the two main vendors were ES&S and another vendor called Diebold Election Systems. And Diebold is really one of the most infamous vendors in the United States. And part of that has to do with the fact that before it was called Diebold, it was called Global Election Systems. And Global's senior vice president and largest shareholder was a convicted embezzler whose crimes involved computer tampering. And this embezzler brought his friend who he'd met in prison to handle punch card printing. Global changed its name to Diebold in 2002 when an ATM manufacturer called Diebold Inc. acquired it. And it acquired it, so that was in the run-up to the big 2004 presidential election between George Bush and John Kerry. And another reason for Diebold's infamy is that its CEO, he was a big fundraiser for George W. Bush. And in a fundraising letter to other potential mega donors, he promised to deliver the swing state of Ohio to George W. Bush, which was not a good look. Unclear whether he was admitting that he was going to commit fraud, probably not, but it was very unsettling for many people to have a very clearly partisan company running our elections. And so what happened was in about 2009, ES&S actually acquired Diebold Election Systems. It made it a subsidiary. But the truth was the two companies were already related because Diebold's president for many years had founded ES&S with his brother, and his brother had remained at ES&S the whole time that he was over at Diebold. So ES&S acquired Diebold, and it gave it 70%, it gave it control of 70% of the US election equipment market. So Chuck Schumer, who was a senator back then, got wind of this and was concerned, and he asked the Department of Justice to intervene and break up the company, or which the Department of Justice did, and they forced ES&S to dissolve Diebold. And what that meant was that it sold a lot of really the intellectual property rights to Diebold's equipment. It sold them to Dominion Voting. So that's when Dominion came in 2010. And it kept, though, ES&S kept most and perhaps all of the Diebold Election Systems contracts. And those, by which I mean, even after you sell the equipment, the vendors maintain contracts to service the equipment, sometimes to maintain the equipment, and really to operate it, in many cases, to an alarming extent on election night. So there you have ES&S is now America's largest vendor. It's 44% of US election equipment. And here is Dominion Voting, which is 37% approximately of US election equipment. And I don't know as much about Dominion Voting. They're newer to the market, but they do some of their programming in Serbia, which is traditionally a close political ally of Russia. So that's a little unsettling. Here are some other vendors. These are much smaller: Hart, Clear Ballot, and Unison. Unison is owned by a company that I forgot the name of it, but it's a big player in sort of the international gaming industry. In Florida uses entirely ES&S and Dominion voting systems. That's what this chart showed. Okay, are these vendors selling? One thing they sell is something, it's called an election management system. And this is like a tabletop computer. It sits in the county election office. It can and sometimes does connect to the internet. And what it does is it provides the programming for every single voting machine in the county or state. And that programming is transferred with memory cards or USB drives from the election management system to the different voting machines. The election management system also, after the precincts close, the totals from all those different precincts have to be compiled together. And so those totals are sent back to the election management system to the part of it that's called a central tabulator. And the central tabulator then aggregates those totals. People sometimes think that vote by mail involves no machinery at all. That is really not the case. It very much uses high-speed central scanners typically to count the mail ballots. And those are, of course, hackable. They can be rigged by corrupt insiders. There is, at least with vote by mail, you do have this paper record of voter intent that you could, in theory, compare to the electronic totals. The vendors also sell equipment for vote by mail. You have to make sure that the signature on the envelope matches the signature that's on file, and they sell equipment to do that. In some places, they do it manually, but even then, as you can see here, they look up your signature on a computer, and then that's what they compare it to. So, in-person voting equipment, there are a number of different options. There are very few places that hand count their elections in the United States. So really what most election security experts recommend is the least amount of equipment possible, but still using equipment, and that is hand-marked paper ballots. So you mark it with a ballpoint pen, and then you count them on, typically at the precincts, but it could be done at the counties on these scanners, which are shown over here on the right. Some of the country, for example, Texas, still uses quite a few. They're called direct record electronic, DRE, usually touchscreen voting machines. And these can either be paperless, or they can have what's called this strip of paper here, where it says VVPAT. That's a voter verifiable paper audit trail. And those are actually kind of have fallen out of disfavor because studies have long shown that most voters never look at these VVPATs. And even if they do, they tend to miss if there are any inaccuracies on there, if there are votes that they cast improperly, that's not what they selected, they tend to not notice that. 1 sec. Okay. So the country had really been moving toward hand-marked paper ballots and scanners, and that really is the majority of the country still. But the vendors who, again, as I mentioned, they are profit motivated. So more equipment makes them more money. And what they did is they sort of sneakily redefined or expanded the meaning of the phrase paper ballot to include machine-marked strips of paper. So instead of a ballpoint pen, you have another touch screen over here that's producing this piece of paper over here on the left. And these are effectively nothing more than a hackable electronic ballpoint pen. And this is a more maximizing on the amount of hackable, malfunctionable equipment, because you typically still use the scanners to count machine-marked pieces of paper, just like you would with a hand-marked paper ballot. So again, just using a touch screen as a ballpoint pen increases complexity, which is kind of just asking for trouble. Just plain old electronic malfunction is a problem, screen freezes, that sort of thing. And if you can see these new touch screens, the piece of paper, what it has is a barcode at the top and then your selections and readable text underneath. The really sneaky thing is the barcode is the only part that's actually counted as your vote. And people can't read barcodes. I can't read barcodes. Some places it's a QR code, by the way, like in Georgia, it's a QR code, maybe even in some places in Florida. But it's the same principle. A QR code is a type of barcode. So that's the only part actually counted as your vote. And so you have no idea what it actually says. In theory, if the state allows manual hand audits or hand recounts, you can use this human readable text to conduct the audit or recount. But again, studies show that most voters never look at this human readable text. And if you'll notice, it doesn't even say, it just has the people's names. It doesn't put if they're Democrat or Republican. So it would be really easy to swap people's names for down ballot races, and most voters probably wouldn't notice. And in fact, a recent study showed that about 93% of inaccuracies on these printouts go unnoticed by voters. So that is a very scary statistic. This is what the country looks like. As you can see, the majority is hand-marked paper ballots and scanners, which is good. There is a significant, about 20.6% is the touchscreen ballot marking devices, and then another About 14% is the old school direct record electronic touchscreens. So that's shown in red. And much of Texas, I think there may be some Texas people on here, much of Texas is both BMDs and DREs. That's Florida. So here's kind of the maddening thing. If you live somewhere like Florida and you say, okay, great, generally we have hand-marked paper ballots. That's what you want. Well, that is true. That is the first step of what you want. But unfortunately, what lawmakers have done in many cases, I use the phrase psych, because they don't actually let you look at the paper manually. And the reason that matters is election security experts are clear that the only way to know if an electronic total has been manipulated, has been rigged, is to hand count in an audit or a recount paper ballots. So they don't, they give it, then they take it away. You've got the hand marked paper ballots, but we're not going to let you look at them. And that's kind of the situation that Florida is in. Even it's what they call a manual recount in Florida is really just running paper ballots back through the machines. And if the machines are hacked, running them back through a hacked machine is going to produce more or less the same hacked results. Then on top of it, to compound the situation, Florida, Texas, and some other places have installed wireless modems in their precinct ballot scanners, those scanners, that connect both the scanner and the county central tabulator to the internet, which just increases the attack surface. There already were ways to manipulate our votes even without this, but this really opens it up to distant bad actors, such as Russia or China or Iran. Another risk of in-person voting has to do with their electronic poll books. These are check-in computers, and they use them also to activate the touchscreen voting machines. They connect to Wi-Fi in many cases, and that is a significant problem if you don't have backup paper poll books. Again, this is when you go to check in to vote, it's to confirm that you're registered and that you haven't already voted. VR Systems is the vendor of poll books that was hacked by Russia, according to the Mueller report, and Florida uses a lot of VR Systems products. The voter registration systems are also quite hackable. They connect to the internet. In 2018, there were a lot of missing South Florida absentee ballots, and that could have been due to a hacked voter registration system or not. Problem is, again, lack of transparency. We just don't really know. I don't think anyone ever figured out why so many were missing. And back to a lack of transparency, we have places like Florida where they won't allow anyone to tell the public which counties were hacked by Russia. We have confirmation that counties were hacked. We don't know if it's 2 or 4 or more, but they won't let the lawmakers. They made them sign actually a non-disclosure agreement so that they wouldn't tell anyone, and that's lack of transparency. We're in Reality Winner, who released the classified report. She leaked it, and it showed that Russia actually had breached VR systems and attacked at least attempted to hack a number of state systems. And it was really important that she did this because Trump had been saying it was fake news. So there had media reports, but he was dismissing them as fake news. By releasing the actual classified intelligence report, she was able to debunk that, but she got 5 years in prison for it and is in fact still there while, Paul Manafort and Roger Stone, et cetera, are free. So here's what we can do on the bright side. There's a lot that we can do still to protect our votes despite all of these problems. First of all, if you decide to vote by mail, you make sure to request your ballot as soon as possible. And if you can, you'll have to call your county or check your county election website. Return it in person rather than through the mail, because the mail service is under assault by the Trump administration, and it would be best to avoid delays to return it in person if you can, to a drop box or an election office. One of the biggest mistakes people make is to not sign the envelope. This is going to be a very big problem in November because people aren't used to voting by mail, and so many people will be. So make sure if you vote by mail to sign the envelope and to follow all other instructions to the T. Things that may not seem particularly important can get your ballot tossed. So for example, apparently a lot of married couples will put both of their ballots into an envelope, and that can get your ballots tossed. This is returning it to a drop box. If you vote in person, I strongly recommend that you find what's called, it's a sample ballot. In some places, they'll mail them to you. Call your county election office if you don't know where your sample ballot is. You can also check on their website. But it's basically a cheat sheet of, I don't mean like you're going to commit fraud, but it's like it shows all the races that are particular to where you live in your county, and you can figure out who you want to vote for before you ever head to the polls. So you can complete it and figure out who you want to vote for before you go to the polls, and it'll make those lines a lot faster, no matter what type of machine you use in person. When you get to the polls, ask to use a ballpoint pen rather than a touch screen to mark your paper ballot. If you don't have any other option, then use the touch screen, but it doesn't hurt to ask. If you do use a touch screen, this is where your sample ballot can come in extra handy, because remember I said that most people don't check these down ballot races, and these are so important this year in terms of gerrymandering, and the redistricting will decide to a large extent control of the U.S. House of Representatives for the next decade. And the people who vote on the new maps are the state lawmakers. So you want to make sure to use your sample ballot to make sure that no races are missing, that everything is exactly as you intended it to be on this printout. And that way, if there is a manual recount or there is a manual audit, we will actually have a reliable paper trail here. This. Voter registration, definitely check your voter registration several times. As I mentioned, the system is on the internet, and so I recommend saving a screenshot for it as evidence, because we need proof. If you get deregistered for some bizarre reason, it would be a help to have proof that you really were registered previously. Here's a number everybody should know, 186-OUR-VOTE, the election protection hotline. It's run by the Lawyers Committee, and they can answer any questions that you have. So I know I've kind of thrown a lot at you. If you have any questions or concerns, you can use this phone number. Report problems to campaigns, report it on social media, report them to the local media. Any problems at all when it comes to voting. We will need lots of poll workers to avoid poll closures. So if you are comfortable with that, definitely volunteer. Contact your county Democratic Party to do that. And you can volunteer to be a poll watcher to watch out for things like voter intimidation. And we need poll watchers too. Again, you can volunteer, just look up your county Democratic Party and they can direct you to the right place. That's too much. Here's something that I think is really important. One thing we still do have time to do is to get these wireless modems removed from the precinct scanners in states like Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Texas. So contact your county election official, be polite and say you have concern about these wireless modems and could they please remove them before election day, before November. I try to tell you they don't connect to the internet. They're wrong. That is just not true. It's been debunked on TV. It's been debunked in many articles by many election security experts. It was the vendors spread the lie that they didn't connect to the internet, but they actually do. And you can contact actually your Secretary of State as well. That might be the best place to start, is with the state election office and the Secretary of State. Another thing you can do is sign up with my protectourvotes.com is the website for a group that I'm in, and we're having people go out after the polls close to photograph precinct results, which are posted outside the polling places, and compare those to the reported totals to make sure that nothing happens at those county central tabulators, which sometimes do have this sort of internet access. So we just want to make sure that those two stay the same. And if you're interested in volunteering, you can go to protectourvotes.com. Democracy Count is actually doing a lot of this as well in Florida. And Perry Busby, who's hosting the call tonight, is doing a lot of this as well. So you can contact him to get more information. Something else you can do is to go to the county election website and screenshot the results as they come in. You want to make sure that the results always go up. The results should never go down. And county results are posted on election night. You just have to, Google wherever your county is, election results, and they post them as they come in. So every 10 minutes or so, you just would want to check and do a screenshot. And then 10 minutes later, check and do a screenshot. And at the end, you just make sure the totals always went the right direction. Digital images are something else. The scanners do create images. These are basically digital photos, basically, of the paper ballots as they go through. Unfortunately, election officials are destroying them in many places. So that's something else you can ask your county election officials to please preserve the digital ballot images. Florida is one place where there's been a lot of activity lately trying to preserve them. So that might be a good place to call county election officials, especially the most populous counties. You can just Google which are the most populous and tell them you want them to preserve the images. And perhaps most important of all, if our candidates lose, demand transparency about their loss, which means, really push for, if there's anything suspicious about it at all, if it's a surprise loss, we really push for things like meaningful manual audits and meaningful manual recounts. And we really didn't get that in 2016. We cannot afford to let our candidates play dead, as they seem to like to do a lot. And that is the end of my presentation.
Okay. Got some feedback.
There we go.
Okay, well, thank you, Jennifer. That was quite a bit to unpack.
Yeah, I can make the handout available to people if they want to look it over again.
Yeah. I guess my question would be, after hearing all of that, and I know you said a lot of things that people are still not familiar with, i.e. The poll tape, and what role does that play in voting? And what is the difference between what are the advantages to voting in person versus vote by mail?
Well, in terms of the advantages of voting in person, it kind of depends on where you are. In general, the most transparent you can possibly have is, again, hand-marked paper ballots counted in public at the precincts on election night, because as soon as those ballots get put into a car or driven someplace, that's not transparent anymore, and that's an opportunity for fraud. But again, we don't do that in the US. So that's sort of the ultimate, and you want to go as close to that as you can without actually doing that. And so voting is closer to that than vote by mail, where there's just a lot of darkness that happens there in terms of the chain of custody. Some places do have ballot tracking, so that improves the situation with the transparency, but most places, I believe, do not have ballot tracking. If you're going, I still prefer in-person voting if you can vote with a hand-marked paper ballot, ballpoint pen, and you're not in a county that is using wireless to transport results to the counties. So you really would have to contact your county election office to see that. Right. I think vote by mail certainly is a reasonable choice in a pandemic, and it's how I vote anyway, regardless of a pandemic. So I think it is a reasonable choice. It can be done well or it can be done poorly, and the same is true of in-person voting. Like I don't really advocate one over the other. I just try to give suggestions to maximize chances of doing either way successfully. So if you do vote by mail, the key thing is going to be receiving it quickly and getting it returned quickly, so that you don't miss a deadline. Because even before the pandemic, a lot of people didn't receive their mail ballots on time. So Los Angeles County, before there was any lockdown or anything, it had nothing to do with it. 17,000 mail ballots did not arrive to voters on time. They requested them and they didn't get them on time. And it's not just Los Angeles County, this happens everywhere. So you want to give yourself a lot of leeway. You want to request the ballot immediately, and then when you get it, you want to find out if you can return it in a drop box or to an election office, and you want to do that as soon as possible. And then with in-person, again, bringing your sample ballot and using it to make sure that whatever you mark reflects what you actually intended, and that whatever you're given includes all of the races that are supposed to be there as reflected on the sample ballot, that there aren't any discrepancies. That is sort of my big suggestion for voting in person and requesting to use a ballpoint pen.
Yeah. You also mentioned that, if possible, if you were in a state like Texas, which does use touchscreen voting to request a ballot, are there some restrictions on that, or in terms of just making that request, or are there
I'm
some?
not sure Texas even, I'm sorry, I don't know that Texas is even allowing no excuse vote by mail. It varies from state to state and maybe even to an extent county to county. So my suggestion, it's a pretty easy, if you have access to a computer, it's probably pretty easy to look it up on your county election website, or your state election website should give you those deadlines. But if not, you can also just make a phone call and ask them.
Okay. Well, we have some questions. I do want the questions from the audience.
Sure.
So we're going to ask Ari to help us with this.
Okay.
Hi, good evening,
Hi, Ari.
everyone. How are you?
Good, how
We
are
have
you?
2 questions from Kevin Norman. His first question is Congress doing anything now to keep these companies under more oversight?
Not in the near time future. There were a lot of efforts over the past few years. The best ones were spearheaded by Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon. He actually had some what would have been meaningful legislation, but it got 0 Republican support and not even as much Democrat support as it should have. I think they thought it was dead in the water. So if we get a majority, or at least improve the situation significantly after this next election, I think that his legislation is a good place to start. It was called the PAVE Act. The SAFE Act was basically another one that was good, that was based on the PAVE Act, either one. But no, right now, I don't think we have any hope for November anyway with Congress, and there is nothing coming down the pike. The GOP killed 3 election security bills in one day. That was Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. Killed literally 3 election security bills in February, and one of those bills would have actually banned these wireless modems. The thing I want to say about the modems, I mean, I have no idea what bad actors might have planned. Maybe they have no interest in these wireless modems. It's possible, but there's really no good reason to use them. And there is time still to remove them. It is not a lengthy process. And if not, remove them to disable them, or at least just not use them. Even that would improve the situation. There's no reason to be activating the internet on election night. So I think that's actually a doable fix. And depending on the Secretary of State, we might be able to get an order out to the counties just to not use them at least, or to remove them.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. And Kevin's second question, can the barcode represent one candidate and the name underneath be a different candidate?
Yes. Yes, I mean, yes, it could look like a perfectly good, it could look like your intent on the outside and in the text, and then the barcode could say the opposite of what you wanted. And that's going to be the only part that's counted as your vote. And what's really frustrating, that text should still give us some security, and maybe it does from a deterrent standpoint, but because we don't really conduct meaningful manual audits in the United States, even of hand-marked paper ballots. And we don't, recounts are always blocked by the Republicans. If we seek them at all, the Democrats tend to not seek them. So the chances of anyone ever looking at the text or even at a hand-marked paper ballot are not as high as I would like. In answer to the question, absolutely yes. The barcode could say absolutely anything.
Wow. Okay, we have another question from Art Levine, who says, since so many states are using consolidated polling places or all county vote centers, so they will definitely be using e-poll books, what should activist groups and citizens do about their security, functionality, poll worker training, since they will be used without paper backup?
Well, so consolidated polling places, is means what it sounds like. It's where they put a bunch of polling places together in one place. And it, just like anything else, it can be done in a fairly good way, or it can be done in a really bad way. And the really bad way, in my opinion, is the Los Angeles County model and Dallas, Texas model, I think Washington, D.C. as well, where voters can, it sounds great, voters can vote anywhere in the county. So that is the type where they will use these electronic poll books to check you in and to confirm that you haven't already voted. But there's no, it's logistically impossible for them to have backup paper poll books for the electronic poll books because of this mishmash consolidation. It just isn't workable. And so the concern I have there is a Titanic situation, which we saw in LA County and to an extent in Georgia as well, where, well, really in LA County, the Wi-Fi connection didn't work. And this would be not hard to pull off in targeted areas. You just interrupt the Wi-Fi connectivity and suddenly everything screeches to a halt and you have these massive lines. And I think we really want to prevent the voters can vote anywhere model. You can have a consolidated center as long as the precincts within it are kept separate. And then it would be no different than if they were in their neighborhood locations. They're just in a different corner of the room. Then then it's not logistically impossible to have these backup paper poll books. So we need to, unfortunately, there's no great answer. You have to, if you're in a sort of a voter suppression state, even if you're not, California is not typically known for voter suppression, but they spearheaded this new terrible voters can vote anywhere model. You need to actually look for your election board, your county election board, and attend some of its meetings and make sure that they don't consolidate in this mishmash way, and make sure that just have to ask, will you have backup paper poll books? And it's a pain in the neck. I wish somebody had done it already. To my knowledge, it hasn't been done that much. The Brennan Center did it in 2018, and it showed about half of the places at that point that were using poll books, electronic ones, had backup paper. So for early voting, it's not possible, by the way, to have backup paper, but there, at least if they all go down, you can come back. It's election day. I'm worried about them going down and being unable to come back. So I don't know, do you have to call and just ask? And then if they're not going to do it, you can let me know at Jenny Cohn 1, and I'm pretty good at making a lot of noise if someone's doing something stupid. I have people making phone calls they called everyone in Michigan, and apparently every county they talked to, they're having the backup paper poll books, so that's good. But that's just Michigan, and it took them quite a while to do it.
Okay. In terms of there were a lot of counties who ended up getting new equipment. One of the things that came out of 2016 was that there were a lot of old equipment. Can you tell us about these new voting machines? Because I hear a lot of cities are getting new voting equipment, and a lot of them are using what's called a new hybrid system. So can you tell us what these new hybrid systems are?
Yeah, there are not that many places, I don't think, actually, that are using what you mean by a hybrid. So I actually cut that off my presentation to shorten it. But so I mentioned this sort of 3 different types of precinct equipment. You had hand-marked paper ballots and scanners, and then you have the old school touch screens called DREs. And then more recently, you have these electronic ballpoint pens that are touchscreen voting machines that still use a scanner. So you have the ballpoint pen, electronic ballpoint pen, and a second scanner. What some places have done is put those back together, join those two together again. So it's one unit. It's a hackable electronic ballpoint pen touchscreen merged with a hackable scanner into one hackable unit. And that is called an all-in-one. Some people call them hybrids. It's frustrating. That term means, the word hybrid, I've heard it used to describe all BMDs, is why I stopped using it. So I call them all-in-ones now. But it increases the electronic complexity is one of the problems. So you are much more likely to have electronic breakdown when you have this many different functions going all together at once. That is one problem. And so Northampton County, Pennsylvania, bought these all-in-one BMD combination things from ES&S, ignoring a lot of experts and a lot of voting rights activists who opposed them and had wanted hand-marked paper ballots instead. They went with this mishmash all in one, and they had massive, massive problems during their debut election, which was, I think, at the end of last year, November. Well, it was at the end of last year. So they ended up having to crack them open and run them through different scanners. And they also had a lot of the problems you see with touchscreens are the things that you might see on your own touchscreen at home, your own laptop or desktop. Screen freezes. Miscalibration is a big thing where it's not aligned. So this is where, you push in for, for Trump, and it defaults to Biden, or vice versa. And oftentimes vendors and election officials will say, oh, well, there's nothing nefarious there. It's just miscalibration. It just wasn't lined up properly. And of course, again, you're getting back to having to take their word for it. I don't know if you were going to rig an election that would be the number one way you'd choose to do it, but I guess you could. You could. It's sort of a lowbrow thing. And yes, it can be done intentionally. It can also be done fairly easily unintentionally. And the vendors are really, unfortunately, kind of scammers. So I saw a marketing video with the ES&S, America's largest vendor, in Pennsylvania, which that's where Northampton County is, saying that miscalibration was not going to be an issue with their new voting machines. And he even did like a Scout's honor, no issue with miscalibration, I promise. And sure enough, something like a third of these all-in-one touchscreens in Northampton County had calibration problems on their debut. And this similarly, a similar number in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and so those are key battleground states.
Yeah, well, the other thing that gets a lot of attention about these all-in-ones is that, I actually think I wrote the first article on them, but the feature I was originally most worried about has, as far as I know, been eliminated everywhere. But there still is a problem. They can technically, so you look at your ballot, you use the touch screen to mark your ballot, and then it spits it out for you, and you look at it and you put it back in. Technically, the machinery is such that it could, if it were maliciously programmed or hacked, add votes, or I guess it could maybe spoil your ballot with stray marks, but it could add extra votes, extra races to your ballot after you've marked it and reviewed it and submitted it. And so that gets a lot of attention, understandably so, and that's been a big talking point in New York. It was actually worse before the one, when I first reported on it, I found them in Johnson County, Kansas. And this was the article I did a couple for them for TYT. They'd flown me out there, and what they had is they gave you the option whether to review the printout for fraud or error or not. And the machine didn't mark the ballot until you decided if you were going to review it for fraud or error, which meant that the machine could be programmed to just do whatever it wanted for those people who decided not to review it. And it was called, permission to cheat. And that had me completely freaked out because Chris Kobach was running at the time, had just won a very dicey gubernatorial primary, and
Chris Kobach is, for people who don't know Chris Kobach,
he's a huge vote suppressor, probably one of the most infamous ever in our country. And so at the time he was the secretary, was he the Secretary of State still? I think he was the Secretary of State running. He was running for governor, and yeah, it just seemed, it was so glaring, such a glaringly bad feature that I thought it seemed kind of suspicious. The new Secretary of State got rid of it. She decided they're going to use separate BMDs and scanners, I guess.
All right. Well, you wrote an article about the Vanishing Black Votes. Can you explain that? I mean, because coming from a African-American community where the vote is always either or, you say that those votes are vanishing. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, I did not come to that conclusion. I was reporting what other people had found. So our friend Benny Smith, who is an election commissioner in Shelby County, Tennessee, which is where Memphis is, there was, in 2015, for years actually, Democrats kept losing in Shelby County, even though it's a majority African-American county. And And for years, there would be these election challenges where they'd say, we think these machines are, maybe rigged. This doesn't seem right, that we should all be losing to the Republicans, even for the county races. But the problem was the machines they were those old school touchscreen DREs, and they had no paper at all. So there was nothing no paper that was software independent that you could compare to the electronic total to see if the electronic total was legitimate. And so they kept getting thrown out of court. And one of the candidates, her name was Wanda, I forgot her last name. I've got to memorize it. But anyway, she went to Benny and said, can you help me out? And I think he thought to look at the poll tapes. So you asked me this before, a poll tape, even for these paperless machines, after all the voting is done, each machine gives a printout or like a long strip of paper that gives all of the totals for each race for that machine. And so what you can do, there's no way to know if those totals are correct, but if the county central tabulator is rigged, where, the place where you send the totals to, if they change them after they get them, that's something you might be able to detect by comparing the two. And so that's what he did. So he compared them, and sure enough, from this predominantly Black precinct in Memphis, the votes were reduced when they were reported at the end. And so Bloomberg, somehow, I don't know if he contacted Bloomberg or what, but Bloomberg sent a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter out to report on this. And they went and they looked at the entire county, and they found 20 predominantly African-American precincts where their precinct totals were being reduced at the other end. So the county total for those precincts was less than what had been shown. And this, by the way, the election board in Shelby County is very white and very Republican due to a state law that says that the county boards, the makeup has to follow the state majority. So not the county majority. So this was written up in Bloomberg, and it really should have gotten more attention than it did when I read it. I couldn't believe it. I read it, I think, before I knew Benny. And the headline was just not it was a very generic headline, something like pricey, new machines are unreliable. So it really didn't get that much attention. And so I've just written about it over and over and over again on my Twitter. And then in Georgia, the machines, by the way, this whole system was from, it was a Diebold, old Diebold system. And remember I said ES&S took over Diebold in the contracts. So ES&S had the contracts in Shelby County. Similar situation existed in Georgia until very recently. They just switched to Dominion, but they had Diebold machines serviced and maintained and operated to an extent, by ES&S. And it was a review of the lieutenant governor's race in 2018 found 127,000 missing votes, by which I mean there was no selection at all for the lieutenant governor in that race. And it was very unusual because typically they looked at statistics to see that typically that race, because it's right under the governor's race, actually has a very high return rate. People don't usually leave it blank. There was no reason to leave it blank. And it was left blank in the predominantly African-American precincts. And they were able to figure out that latter part by reviewing again these precinct poll tapes. Somehow, I don't understand exactly how, but I talked to the Marilyn Marks at the Coalition for Good Governance who did this analysis. And she said the poll tape review helped them figure out that the missing votes were predominantly in African-American precincts. And so that was written up in the root. And so what I did is I wrote an article that said, hey, wait, look over here and look over here. And, that's kind of coincidental. It's the same Diebold ES&S combination, paperless machines, and horrifically vanishing Black votes in both places. This should be all over the news. And so I'd been meaning to write it up for a while, and I finally did, and I put those two together. And the part of the reason I did also was because Benny I had found out anyway, that they were looking to buy new equipment and they wanted to go with ES&S again. And I was sort of like, over my dead body, I'm going to print an article and try to educate more people that, no, this vendor does not deserve another contract.
Right. Okay.
Unfortunately, they haven't decided, by the way. That's still pending. They're going to be using, unfortunately, the same old crappy machines in November. And then the decision about new equipment will be next year.
Ari, you had another question?
Yes. Do we have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So, Ellen, says that it seems that the digital ballot images are saved as PDF files with millions of voters. How would we efficiently audit a large election or specific race? What is the best software to audit ballot images?
So John Brakey at Audit USA is sort of the master of ballot images. And actually tomorrow I'm interviewing someone named Ray Lutz, who has a program to make it easier to actually conduct an audit using the images. So he actually has software where you would somehow download it in and it will make it a lot easier. Yeah, I think it's kind of hard. I mean, you have a separate USB drive for the in-person voting. You would have a separate USB drive, I think, for each machine, with images for each machine. And then you'd have to have all of those for every precinct. And then you have to have, and the counties, and it would be an awful lot of USB drives. So I don't really know how that would work, but there are people looking at it, and a good place if you want more information is Audit USA. Is it .org, I think? Well, if you type in Audit USA, their website will come up, and they probably have more detailed information than I know.
Okay.
Places are doing it, though. And in Florida, they actually had filed a big lawsuit in Florida because, a lot of people in the election integrity movement, election security movement were involved in the 2000 Chad debacle, and they've been doing it ever since. So they were very worried about another possible presidential recount in Florida and having another debacle. And they didn't get as much relief as they wanted due to some procedural blocks put up by the election officials objecting on these procedural grounds and delaying things. And so what they did get, though, is at least an agreement that the images would not be destroyed if there is a presidential recount in Florida. But the images will only be of the undervotes and the overvotes, because that's the only thing Florida recount law allows you to look at in a recount. And undervote means you left it, people that left it. Ballots which have no selection at all for, let's say it's the president, no selection at all for the president, and ballots that have two choices selected, according to the machine, two choices selected for the president. Those are manually evaluated under Florida recount, but nothing else. I mean, at least it's something, I guess, because especially with the overvote, you selected two. A lot of times it's pretty obvious when you actually manually look at it that it's not really an overvote. You can tell that was just a stray mark that wasn't meant to be a selection. People often are worried that paper ballots will be like the hanging Chad debacle, by the way, in 2000, and it's actually different. So Chads, with the dislodging the bubble, and then the paper would kind of stick, and there were even talks of the vendors in that election, at least Sequoia, and I believe ES&S as well, where perhaps the holes could have been cut certain ways, making it easier or harder for them to be dislodged. And the paper stock could be, if you switch the paper stock, it could also make them stick or not stick. And so, you can put them in sort of targeted Democratic, if you're a bad actor who wants a Republican to win, or vice versa, you put them in targeted areas to make it not work. We're not talking about that. Nobody does punch cards anymore. No one's advocating that. It's really the ballpoint pen, and that we do not have a lot of recounts in the U.S., so there isn't a lot of examples for us to look at. But Minnesota did have a statewide one in the Al Franken Senate race. He filed the recount request, and they do allow manual recounts in Minnesota, which is also very unusual. They asked, and it was allowed, and they conducted it. And out of 2.9 million ballots that were reviewed, a bipartisan panel, so both Republicans and Democrats, were able to agree on the intent of all but 14. So the intent was actually quite clear. It wasn't a hanging Chad situation.
Thank you so much. And probably our last question for the evening, Elizabeth Brisbaugh says, who is on their canvassing board and how are they verifying signatures, for example? We would love to get more people on board to learn about their own precincts and share information.
I'm not sure, Elizabeth, what you mean by there. It actually, like with everything else, it is unfortunately going to be very county specific. And so for your own county, you can call and ask. It would be nice. I initially had envisioned recruiting a lot of volunteers to observe the counting of the signatures to make sure that they were making phone calls, for example, before tossing ballots in the garbage can. And I don't know. I did a presentation and the Ohio Democratic Party was there and they said that as far as they know, no, you can't do that. You can't volunteer to do that. They didn't dislike the idea. It's just there wasn't a vehicle really to do that. You might be able to sit at a long distance where you won't be able to tell what's going on. And so, I don't know, it's sort of Scrutineers, by the way, scrutineers.org. They are an organization to look at if you're interested in organizing this type of project. Unfortunately, we're sort of the ones who have to do it. Most large voter protection groups that have a lot of funding do not focus on the machines and do not focus, well, they might focus on signature match. They probably do to an extent on that aspect of it. But we have to take a lot of this on ourselves and it's not really fair. And typically it's grueling work and not funded, but no, it's kind of satisfying. And to know that you're doing something that darn it, other people should be doing and they're not, but somebody's got to do it. So you're going to do it. It can be kind of satisfying. And scrutineers.org, if you're interested in organizing that type of thing or seeing if anyone else is already organizing that type of thing where you figure out who is doing this signature comparisons and whether it can be publicly observed, that would be a great place to start.
Great. Well, we've enjoyed it. I know this is a lot for a lot of people who have not really engaged in our elections beyond voting. But do you have maybe just 2 or 3 simple things that they can take away that they can use, i.e. what they can do to help prepare, as well as what they can do in terms of their local precinct, as you said, about the poll tape. If they wanted to know more about that,
Harry,
how would you suggest that?
What is the name of your organization where you did the poll tapes? Because I know you spearheaded a big effort in Broward.
Right. It's here in Broward, it's Citizens Audit Broward. And we're headed up by Jamie Friend. I think Jamie's on the chat tonight, but Jamie's more the upfront person. I'm the back end data cruncher guy, but we definitely need volunteers to help citizens who really want to know the results for their community. Mr. Henry, I had Mr. Henry in the August election. He went to take a picture of the poll tapes. And so how was that for you, Mr. Henry?
Well, am I muted?
No.
Well, it was new to me. In certain circles, I call myself a dinosaur when it comes to certain things. And so for me, that viewing of the polling tape after the precinct was closed was something else. So much so that I kept the video.
It's pretty interesting.
I think from our perspective, I think from our perspective, there are a lot of things that go on that we have not got involved with. And for us to I'm speaking about the community now, for us to totally understand the significance of what it is to vote in its totality, we need to be involved from start to finish. Now, you mentioned earlier at the beginning about the voting, the machines. My question was, or statement is, if we follow the money, we will be assured to what is taking place. And I'm saying that, because you mentioned the 2 machines, and I want to ask you, of those 2 companies that did the machines, how much money did they make? Those 2 companies, the 2
the Diebold and ES&S. Well, I think, up front, Diebold technically kind of was going bankrupt. So the equipment itself, I don't think, it makes them some money, but where they get most of the money has to do with the ongoing contracts, the servicing, maintenance, and there's another word for it. But a lot of times they actually often are the ones, the vendors like ES&S in particular. Often they are the ones that are programming those election management systems. They're putting all the ballots that are all the names that are going to be on the ballot, all the races that are going to be on the ballot to be programmed in. And so these people at ES&S, and we don't know who they are, right? They're programming that in, and then that gets sent from that central system to all the different voting machines. I don't know how much they make. There's also the possibility of under the table payments, but I'm just the money has been, I mean, the corruption of those companies, they make a lot of donations to election officials under and over the table, usually, but not always. So both ES&S and Dominion donations to Mitch McConnell, who blocked then some election security bills that would have actually effectively banned most of these new barcode machines that make them more money than hand-marked paper ballots and scanners do. Yes, you absolutely following the money. In Philadelphia, they made donations through lobbyists to the two decision makers who then chose their machines that a lot of people, a lot of voting rights activists were objecting to, and experts. There were these hearings, lots of people were going. They chose them anyway, and it turned out later the city comptroller conducted an investigation and found out that they were undisclosed, I mean, illegal. They weren't supposed to, donations made to the decision makers, but the city decided to keep the contract anyway. So they fined ES&S a couple $1 million, I think, and they kept the contract. They got to keep the contract. Yeah, I don't really, yes, following the money. I mean, ES&S is just outrageous. They have open bars for their, you know, they become friends. It's more than just the money is the thing. It's more insidious than that. Even if it's not a lot of money, you establish a relationship, and that helps you get repeat business, and it also makes you want to take their word for it on things like whether modems connect to the internet or not. The poll tapes, by the way, if somebody wants to do it, again, protectourvotes.com. We are doing it nationally. We're trying. It's, you know, we have a pretty good photo uploader. So you go and you take the photos, and people have liked our uploader a lot. You just upload them on there. The analysis end of it, we have a lot of volunteers for that, but we could use more. But people seem to get a little freaked out about the analysis part. So we're working on the best way to do that. Oh, there's your poll tape.
I'm trying to show my poll tape.
Yeah, they look like long receipts, right?
To show it.
And so you need multiple photos usually. And then what you would do is probably put those transcribed from the photos onto a spreadsheet, the numbers, and then you go compare it to the county reported. So anyway, protectourvotes.com, we're doing it. I know democracycounts.org has done a lot in Florida, and we've done some in Florida, but they definitely got on that earlier. And they have some really, and Perry, tell me if I'm saying anything wrong, because I know you work with them. They said that 20% for about, I think they got tapes for about 100 precincts, or 100 tapes or 100 precincts, one or the other. And about 20% of those in the March primary had discrepancies with the reported totals. And is it?
In March, it was more, I think.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
11%. So there yeah, I mean, it was.
Well, even still, it's odd. 10% is pretty high. And then he says that there's 30% of, I mean, I think they've only analyzed 45 tapes so far, which is, I don't want to say only, it's still quite a few actually. It's time. But they said about a third of those have discrepancies. Yeah. So, but he's going to double check everything and cross his T's and dot the I's before making a big splash out of it. But yeah, it's absolutely worth doing. And when you start figuring out how the processes go, then you want to know more. And yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And by the way, Belarus, which is having this big sort of, they already have a dictator, and they had another election that internationally pretty much everyone recognized as being incredibly fraudulent. Like, you know, a very small, sort of like a 70-30, 30% wanted the guy, 70% didn't, and they inverted it to be 70-30 the other way, or maybe even higher for him. But the people there, because they're sort of used to living in a dictatorship, they actually had their cameras at the precincts to photograph their ballots. And people ask me about this a lot. Unfortunately, in the US, to prevent vote buying, which is apparently or was a thing, people would pay you to vote a certain way. To prevent that, we are not allowed in most places to take photographs at the precincts. So we can't do that. Belarus, they were doing that, and then they were comparing that to the reported totals. We would do that if we could, but we can't. The precinct totals, the poll tapes are the next best thing, because it is still the precinct results, and you still are comparing those to the reported totals. So it's a similar concept. And, you know, we're just sort of dabbling in autocracy right now. But or dictatorship. Hopefully we'll be able to stave it off, and certainly want to make sure that we have done what we could do. We don't want to be left asking, you know, it would be nice to have some evidence, some data to look at if we don't like, if the election outcome seems suspect. And we don't want to be left without data to look at. And, you know, and so these poll tapes can be very useful. And if that's too data analytic-y for you, or you don't want to go out after dark to take photos, volunteering as a poll worker is a really great thing. And just, you want to make sure, obviously, to have a mask, and I'd say also order a face shield on Amazon or elsewhere. They're selling them at a lot of drugstores now and hardware shops. I got mine. But volunteering as a poll worker, the more eyes we have on things, and the more people are kind of tuned in that you should report it if there's a problem, if the machines are all down, if there's, you know, if the machines are flipping votes, if people are saying that the printout doesn't match their intent, having poll workers in there that know to look for these things is really helpful. And again, scrutineers.org is a good place to get information about that. My Twitter timeline also, I should say, at Jenny Cohn 1, I write about all of these issues on it pretty much on a daily basis. JENICOHN 1. But being a poll worker is great, and then poll watcher, I think, is also going to prove to be really important, because Trump is supposedly sending out, you know, like 50,000 people as his army. At least he's trying, and he has a lot of bluster, so it probably won't really be 50,000. But we need to have sort of, as Democrats, a force of our own, I think, out there. And in particular, and also not just on election night, by the way, with the poll watchers, the counting, again, having said we can't really watch the signature match that carefully, there are aspects, I think, of the absentee processing that can be observed. And, you know, you might not know what you're looking for, but you get the hang of it once you've looked a while. And having people doing that, and the parties usually train you, by the way. I should have said that. The parties will train you to an extent, know what to look for. Scrutineers.org can give you some additional ideas of what to look for if you're a poll monitor or a poll worker, and it can be really helpful.
Okay, great. I really enjoyed this for a kickoff
Thank you.
event. I think you really set the tone for how broad.
Yeah, there's a lot of aspects.
I think we tend to take it that elections have not changed since the 60s. You know, where we go, we vote, and we leave. But so much has changed. And so I really appreciate you taking this time to break this open. Tomorrow night, Benny Smith will be here. And you heard Jenny talk about.
So I know, I said to him, I'm like, we can never say our names together, Jenny and Benny. It's too much.
I know, Jenny and Benny. But Benny will be here, and we'll talk about what happened in Memphis and how he went about finding out the poll tapes, and just some of the things that he's doing now as an election.
That'll be really good.
And how
he's fantastic.
Yeah.
And so is Emily, by the way, and who's coming, and Greg Pallas. There, you have a really great lineup. Thank you so much for putting me at the start. Hey, can I just say one other quick tip? I mean, I mentioned it, but just to highlight it, the bringing your sample ballot to the polls. If I had one tip to bring that most people are not messaging, they should. Honestly, bringing your sample ballot completed, bring it with you. It makes a huge difference. And if you use a touchscreen, use it to look at that printout, take the time and make sure it matches, that nothing is missing or flipped or otherwise not correct.
Cool.
Okay. All right, thanks. We're gonna close it out.
Sure, why not? We missed, you know, if we didn't get a chance to read your question or mention your statements, we do apologize. We can make amends on tomorrow night when we have Benny here. But Jennifer, I do want to say thank you. I enjoyed it. And those that we come in contact with, we will definitely point them in a direction to get more information and more knowledge and more training. And I do know that there are other folk out there doing it that we need to piggyback on. If everybody's doing a little bit, nobody has to do a lot. And I want to thank Destination Sis Trunk for allowing us to be here, right here in the community. It's all good in the hood, and that's where we are, right here, right in the heart of our community. So I want to say thank you to Destination Sis Trunk and the Fort Lauderdale Convention and Visitors Bureau for allowing us to do this. And to all of you out there listening, please join us tomorrow. And again, if we miss your question or your statement, we will definitely make sure that we get it in tomorrow. And make sure your signature matches on your return.
And make sure you sign your
ballot.
your return ballot
Okay?
too. That's one of the #1 mistakes that people make, is not signing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, guys. Good night.
Thank you.